Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. I am Don Leonard. No, I'm not Don Leonard. Don couldn't be here today, and he asked me to pinch hit for him. I'm his alternate on the council, and so I wanted to just interesting point of fact, in the 13 years that the council has been going, this is only the third time that Don has not been able to make it. So I want to give a shout out to Don for his long and dedicated service on the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, and thanks to each of you for being here. I know that we have a quorum, both in person and line, so we're ready to go. And then let's see, we typically do this, but do a little bit of an introduction, both for the members of the council. We've got Dave Livermore. Dave, it's good to see you online. Thank you. And then if we could just go around the table a bit, Jeff, maybe start with you. Just introduce yourself and who you represent on the council. We'll go around the table and then we'll hit the audience as well. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Jeff Richards. I represent the migratory bird production areas.
Joe Havasi, extractive industry.
Waylon Myers, wastewater.
Tim Hawks, aquaculture.
Tom Ward, municipalities.
Tom Tripp, Twilla County.
Marisa Weinberg, Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Annabelle Latinci.
Randy Elliott, Davis County.
Jim Harris, the Division of Water Quality.
Thanks, Jim. And Marissa's going to pass that mic around. So audience members, thanks.
Rob Hartman, U.S. Magnesium.
Lee Perry, Box Elder County Commissioner.
Blake Bingham, Water Rights.
Linda Freitas, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
Liz Waite, resident in West Valley City.
Kathy Chambliss, resident in Salt Lake City.
Dwight Slaw, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation.
Heather Dove, Great Salt Lake Audubon.
Monjo Masson, Central Davis Sewer.
David Jackson, photographer for UPHE.
Johnny Vasic, Executive Director for Utah Physicians for Healthy Environment.
Jamie Barnes, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Ben Starman, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Keith Hambrecht, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Morgan Faulkner, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Ben Holcomb, Division Water Quality.
Liesl Roberts, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Max Malmquist, National Audubon Society.
Adam Wickline, National Audubon Society.
Marcel Shoup, National Audubon Society.
Jeff Denblaker, Jacobs.
Thanks, everybody, and again, welcome. I'd note Lee Perry is an old friend of mine, a legislative colleague, and Lee has been, at least initially, volunteered. I'm not quite sure what it is, Lee, but he's lost a bet to be Box Elder's representative on the council. He's not been yet confirmed by the Senate, however, and so he'll officially join us here in the next little bit, probably before our next meeting. But welcome, Lee. It's great to have you. I look forward to working with you on the council. Thanks. So in advance of the meeting, an agenda was circulated. Didn't get any comments on that. Unless there's any changes, can I get a motion to approve the agenda from a member of the council?
So moved.
Tom, so moved. Like a second. Second, Leland. All in favor of approving the agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Seeing none, it's unanimous. The agenda is approved, and the motion's approved, and the agenda is adopted. We also have meeting minutes dated May 9th, 2023, distributed in advance of the meeting. Have not seen any comments on that. Any changes to the minutes? Anybody have any amendments to the minutes? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes dated May 9th, 2023. Tom?
Mr. Chairman, I've examined the minutes. I think they're representative of what went on, and I move that we approve them.
Thank you for that fine motion, Tom. Appreciate it. Motion by Tom Tripp, second. Joe?
Second.
Second by Joe Havasi. Thank you, Joe. All in favor of approving the minutes dated May 9th, 2023, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. Any abstentions? No objections, no abstentions. The minutes are approved. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're still waiting on Brian Steed, I believe, right? Anybody seen Brian? Okay, so we're gonna flip-flop. We're gonna flip-flop agenda items because we're gonna kick off with Brian.
Hey, Tim.
Is he here? Oh, he's walking in. Perfect. All right. Where's that short mic? You got it, Marisa? We got short mic. So just to give folks background, as you probably know, this last session, the legislature adopted passed House Bill 491, and part of that included something called the Great Salt Lake Commissioner Act. Brian, we want to make sure we reserve the best microphone for you. It marks kind of one of the interesting things, if you say like who has responsibility for the Great Salt Lake from the standpoint of state agencies, a lot of hands go up because they all have a different responsibility over the land or the air or the water or what have you. And so there's a lot of interlocking division of wildlife resources also. A lot of different agencies have a different stake in Great Salt Lake and responsibility for Great Salt Lake. And so the idea with the commissioner was really to allow the state to speak with one voice and to really have a strong centralized voice for the lake. And then one interesting aspect is the way that the new commissioner plugs into the existing framework of advocacy for the lake is that the commissioner is this council gives advice to the commissioner. And so we'll be refining that, looking how that's going to work in practice over time, but we're pleased to have Brian Steed with us today. And Brian's been in the saddle a long time. He has a crystal clear mission plan. Really thrilled to have Brian. He's a personal friend. Many of you know Brian. He was former head of the Department of Natural Resources. He currently directs, I'm not going to say the whole name, Brian, something with land, air, and water at Utah State University. All right. He wears a lot of hats. He juggles a lot of stuff, but we're thrilled to have him just start working as the Great Salt Lake Commissioner, and he's been gracious enough to come today and talk a little bit about his role and how he sees this moving forward. And then I think there's an opportunity for some questions from members of the committee. Brian, we've got about 30 minutes on this, so we can take all of that or not all of that, but we'll turn it over to you. And then if we have questions from the council or from members of the public, we'll do that, come to it. So we'll turn it over to you. And you don't have to use the baby mic.
I don't know why I got this. It's awesome though. I'll take it. Thank you so much. So my name is Brian Steed. I'm really happy to be here, and especially in the new role as the Great Salt Lake Commissioner. As Tim mentioned, this has been in existence for a very long time, 12 days now. And so we've got it all figured out. A little about me. I have worked in this space for some time. Back during last year's legislative session, actually Tim and I were able to work a little bit on this legislation with Speaker Wilson and then with Majority Leader Schultz regarding what the intent is on how we bring a little more cohesive view on the Great Salt Lake with the various entities that are working on it. When we were drafting that legislation, I have to be very honest that I had one person in mind, and it was not me. It was Tim. Tim was wise enough to say no, and I'm the idiot who said yes. So I'm happy to be here, honestly, and working on this issue. As was mentioned, I wear two hats right now. I'm also working as the director of the Janet Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air at Utah State University. That's the full name. It's a fold-out business card. The reason I think that's important to point out is twofold. One, this is something that we've been working on for some time. I was co-chair of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, as well as a variety of other efforts on the Great Salt Lake, even after I left the Department of Natural Resources. Secondly, just as way of introduction, I do think that the Great Salt Lake is the consummate land, water, and air issue facing Utah currently. How we use our land impacts how much water we have. How much water we have impacts air quality in our region. And that's something I think that we're going to have to figure out how to manage all three of those components in order to effectively come up with the strategy on the Great Salt Lake. In terms of short term, I am tasked with coming up with a strategy by November 20th and reporting that back to the state legislature. I am currently a shop of exactly one, and so we're already starting to work on this. My guess is this: we are not going to have a 400-page government document detailing every facet of how we're going to manage the Great Salt Lake going forward. But what we will have is broad brush strategies on how we can get more water to the lake and how we can manage the resource over a long time frame. Three general principles I think that we all have to get through, though. One is this has to be a collaborative effort. None of our individual efforts is going to be sufficient to save the Great Salt Lake. Two, I do think we have to have more coordination between the different entities that are engaged on the Great Salt Lake. For many years now, we've had various entities that are working on this issue, some governmental, some non-governmental. Those groups have not always coordinated and have not always even communicated. I think that it's time now. I mean, and I would commend the GSLAC as being one place where people were able to have a meeting in the minds. But I think there's got to be more of this, and we look forward to having a more formal role of GSLAC and bringing people together on what it is on the Great Salt Lake. Third, I think that we're going to have to be innovative and looking at the different types of ideas and be aware that because this is a large issue, we're looking for large solutions. And those large solutions might require a bit of shared sacrifice from all Utahns. And that's not something I say lightly, but we have an issue in Utah that if we don't get this right, I think that we face a severe sense of regulatory actions that none of us can really live with, whether that comes from the federal government or from court action, either of which I think probably puts us not in the driver's seat of our own futures, and I think that would be a mistake. And so we're going to have to figure out those innovative solutions and work together and make those investments to really save the lake. With that broad introduction, and rather than ramble on, I wanted to say just two more things. One, I wanted to say thank you. This room is filled with people who care passionately about the Great Salt Lake. That at times was not as popular as it is now. And that also required a fair amount of investment of your own personal time and resources to care about something that really benefits all of us. So thank you so much for your willingness to do that. Secondly, I'd like to offer an invitation. We are all in this together. Join us as the Commissioner's Office, and let's figure out how to save the Great Salt Lake because it's too important to let go away. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, Brian. And those of you everybody that's familiar with Brian's work know how lucky we are to have him in this role. And he's a natural fit based on his expertise and really great to work with. So look forward to working with you, Brian. And thanks so much for coming in and presenting. Questions from members of the council. Tom, looks like you've got questions.
Brian, I'm really enthused to have you in this position. What is your contact information now? Is that available on a website?
So sure. It is not available on the website yet because there is no website. But it is bsteed@utah.gov is my email. So bsteed@utah.gov. And I have been given a state phone, which I do not know the number of, but I can find out. So hang tight on that, and I'll get it for you. Hey, in the meantime, though, if you need to reach me, I will still keep my personal phone, which is 435-770-5181.
Thanks, man. Tom?
Brian, really excited. Aside from knowing your background, just your introduction and the way you addressed us shows you're in it for the right reasons and you're the right guy. Maybe I'll throw out what I see, and maybe others do too, is probably the biggest opportunity/challenge. And that's agricultural water use and the way we use water like we did in 1911. And I would throw out something that as an observer of things that have worked and not worked some have had serious crashes of their industries and economic and social, and some have seen some really striking embracing of modern technology. I'll throw out two examples for you. You know, we have alfalfa in a place that if you were to pick the best place to grow alfalfa, this wouldn't be it. We claim to produce food to supply our state, which I think the numbers don't really stack up. And so when we talk about winners and losers, we have, as you said, everyone. It's not agriculture, it's, you know, the homeowner on the lot. But the reality is, you know, Mrs. Jones in Salt Lake City who converts her landscape and saves a drop, pales in comparison. It's not going to solve the problem. And I would proffer, and maybe others would agree or disagree, that this problem will not be solved without a landscape change on how we address agriculture in the state of Utah. And the example I would throw out is you look at the Dutch, who are landlocked by an ocean, decided 20 years ago they would not have sustainable food sources. And over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, they can produce about 12 times the amount of produce on the same amount of water that we do here in the West. And it's a little bit, I see an opportunity for the Beehive State to step up and show the United States how to kick butt and do it the right way. And absent of going all in on that, including agriculture, we will sit here 10, 20 years from now and say, dagnabbit, we did a lot and didn't do squat. So I've thrown in a question there. Do you see agriculture, how do we get to move to that? Or is that, am I off target? Is that not the main opportunity? We all need to be on board. A lot in there. I'll let you pick what you want to respond to.
Well, I'll start with, I'm not familiar with the Dutch example. I'm happy to talk more about that and learn more how the Dutch have done that. But let me talk generally about agriculture. Agriculture historically has been an important part of the state. It has become, as an economic driver, for the majority of the state, a less important part of it. However, there are certain areas that it's still one of the major economic activities. There's a reason we ended up growing alfalfa, because we could grow it well, and we have a comparative advantage on the type of crops that we can grow on alfalfa. It's higher protein and higher value than other crops. And there's an additional component. You don't have to till it, and it can grow year over year, which is a benefit, right, if you're a farmer. That being said, if you look at how water is used in the state, and especially in the Great Salt Lake Basin, agriculture has historically used the majority of that water. And I think that we have to have a conversation with agriculture on how we can make that work better. And I think the state is on the pathway to that. I think that we have to probably be having more aggressive conversations. But on the pathway, let's talk about that generally. Over the last 2 years, the state's invested somewhere around $270 million on agricultural optimization. Those policies actually have been shown to have a meaningful water savings. Dr. Matt Yost at Utah State University has evaluated a variety of different types of water uses and shows that you can save, you know, in many cases, 15% of water use with having the exact same amount of crop production, right? That is certainly a bridge that we have to look at, because if we were able to have 15% of water that's currently used in agriculture diverted to the Great Salt Lake, that's a sizable quantity of water. And so we have to work with those producers. Second, just general principle though, there is a tendency, I think, in all conversations to say, not us, but them. And ag certainly feels like it's under the gun on this. And I think that we don't want to pick a fight with agriculture in the state. I think we want to work with agriculture to find joint solutions that work for agriculture and work for the state writ large. And that's the spirit I'm going to take on that. And I mean, I think there's a lot of people that very much want to have some social engineering and say, we're just going to tell farmers not to farm anymore. I think that in a state like Utah, that is not a viable option. I think we have to work with the existing infrastructure we do have. But I'm more optimistic to think that yes, farmers seem to get it. And I think that we are going to work very closely with agriculture and make real differences on how we use that. Last part, I do think that we're going to have to look at how we potentially enter into business arrangements with agriculture in that they own a fair amount of water rights and things like split season leasing, which has not been, it's been developed as a legal strategy. It has not been developed as a practical strategy currently. Getting that underway, I think, is going to be something that we really have to look at hard. That was a long and rambling answer to a long and complicated question too. So
I want to thank you because you went to right where I would hope you would go, in the sense that ag should not be a loser in this process. That we will have saved the lake, but yet they will be at a better place. But getting there and getting people to understand that process on a vision as opposed to concrete examples is a hard task. So thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Leland, you've got a question.
Hi, thanks. We've done a couple of studies with the council looking at the levels of conservation that are necessary in order to not delay, but to not require further water development in order to support additional population growth. Those studies indicate that we're going to see significant changes in how people utilize water, including shifting to wholesale across the board, 100%, shifting to water saving in-home fixtures, and also changing landscape requirements and ordinances. How do you perceive, and I know that there's been a battle at the legislative level between that being a local ordinance that's controlled by the municipalities versus the state. But when I drive around, I'm a fanatic on park strips and hating them.
Well, I've watered I've lived in my house for about a year now. It's been on my plan to take mine out, but I've been noticing I've watered my pavement pretty consistently, and it hasn't grown an inch. I don't know.
And so I'm not a big fan of it, but I drive around, I don't see a lot of conversion yet. And I know that that's going to be something we're going to have to address, is this conversion of landscape to water conserving processes. How do you perceive the state's role, your role would be in trying to ensure that that occurs?
So I think that we have to be very honest with where we are. We are where we are in part because we've put to beneficial use all the water we've got. And that has been to the detriment of the Great Salt Lake. So we're going to have to figure out how to grow in a situation where we don't have a lot of extra water. I mean, we're going to have to move around those parts. We can take it from agriculture, move it to M&I. M&I, you can be more efficient in M&I, but I don't envision that we're going to have a bunch more water just dumped on us. This past winter being the exception, which was awesome. But I think that we're going to have to be very cautious of how we grow. And that's not to say that we don't grow. It's to say that we are going to have to understand that conservation is the price of growth. That is where we're going to have to be, and we're going to have to grow in a way that is different than we have grown historically. One of the things we've been working on at Utah State is this notion of water neutral growth. I don't think the state is probably there yet to say that we're going to do that in the M&I sense, but being closer to that and being more conscientious on how we grow, I think is important. And if I can say just anecdotally, interestingly, the parts of the state that I would have told you 2 years ago would never get there are getting there faster than I would have thought. I mean, and I'll cite Washington County, which has had some of, outside of the Great Salt Lake, so it's an easy target. They have had some of the more aggressive countywide policies imposed, which to be very honest, working in Department of Natural Resources wouldn't have envisioned in the short term. They're seeing that that's the price of growth there, and they're going to have to be a lot more water conscientious, and they're doing that. So I would envision that we'll get there as well. To your question on the legislature and how I engage the legislature, I think my role is to be a convener as well as to be an educator when it comes to the legislature and pointing out where we are. And in truth, we have a water budget. That water budget is not going to increase, and so we're going to have to make do within the means that we have, and make sure that we do things like save the Great Salt Lake, which is not a trivial amount of water.
Thank you. Additional questions, Randy?
So I have a question of changing state law a little bit. Currently I'm on Weber Basin Water Districts Board, and it's been a great year. We have plenty of water. And I said, why can't we restrict this year? Why can't we shorten the seasons? Do anything else we can do? And said, according to our water policies that we have, we can't, because it's been an abundant year. And I'm like, well, the Great Salt Lake is still short. We need to get more water to the Great Salt Lake. But according to the water policies that we have in place, we can't restrict anymore this year. We can't tell people when to water, when not to water, and it's just a free-flowing year again. And so it's kind of frustrating on the part of the water boards that we serve on, that on the years that we have excess, that we can't get any more to the lake because we as a board, can't mandate anything to the public on water restrictions currently.
Randy, to be clear, did they say that was a statutory
Uh-huh.
requirement? There was something in code that
Right.
prohibited that?
Yep.
I think that we should look into that.
Yeah, I think we should too.
Okay.
Yep.
And I'm happy to help with that. I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. What I would say, though, I think the point is good. We do need to make sure that we keep our foot on the accelerator of conservation. In good water years and in bad water years, it makes no difference. We have the same problems. And candidly, if we want to get more water to the lake, having large conservation measures in good water years is probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, just to put a little finer point on it, Randy, it was interesting. Last year was dire by any stretch, any calculation. It was unprecedented, but in many swaths further south, you had no conservation measures last year. And that's because they're sitting on so much storage through Central Utah Project that it just didn't trigger. So we have some regional.
Yeah, regional would be nice because they transfer a lot of that water up above into that because they made those rules back in the 1900s when the population was down there and not over here. And so we transfer a lot of the Weber water over to the Central Utah Water Project, and they have abundance and we don't. So, water wars, here we go.
We were sending water to that direction when we weren't sure whether we were going to have enough drinking water through the end of the year. Tom, you've got a question, and then
Yeah,
I
just
think
kind
Joe,
of
you've got
even a
one.
housekeeping sort of thing. So does the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council report now to the commissioner? Do we still report to natural resources and environmental quality? How does all of this kind of logistics fit together?
So
are you just an extra guy to help us out, or
just an
are
extra
you in
guy?
charge?
No. It's a good question. In terms of this body, no, I'm not in charge. This body is advisory to the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, right? And we will take that under the role that it's intended.
But our advice now goes to you?
Yes.
Not all of our advice, but in terms of, we still have the normal reporting, Tom, stuff requirements that we would normally have. It's just that in his new capacity as Great Salt Lake Commissioner, we have a responsibility to advise him in that role.
So this is our figurehead.
I'm a little bitter about that.
I put us on par. No.
I've been called many things,
I
Tom.
can think of something more grandiose than that, Brian. I'm trying to think the right term.
Here's what I would say. As I mentioned before, this is going to take as many big brains as we have. And as we set this commission officer or this commission office up, we had two options. We could create yet another advisory board, right, in the states, which then we have, I don't know how many we have, but I've been doing the math on this. There are many, many advisory boards on this. We thought that's probably not the wisest policy option. And so we said, who will be the advisory board for the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office? And we thought GSLAC seems like they're already doing that in a more meaningful way than probably anyone else. And that's how we ended up in this role. So as a figurehead or whatever, no, honestly, I look forward to working with you all and taking any direction that you all give. And that's, I think, will be very helpful.
Thanks, Joe.
Welcome, Brian. Several years ago, I reported to the council, may have been like late April, early May, that the Bear wasn't flowing beneath our bridge. And it caught me by surprise because it wasn't a great snowpack, but it wasn't terrible either. And it was recognized that our dashboard was limited, sort of the Great Salt Lake sort of typical dashboard. And this council invested in the hydromapper facilitated by USGS. And it's just meant to expand the sort of the view. It's not a complaint, but sort of an observation. When you look at who's attending, you don't have agriculture and you don't have the water conservation districts present. I'm not sure how that would formally work, but there may be opportunity for enhanced communication, sort of reports from the various water conservation districts and an integration, just so we sort of know what to expect per Randy's mention of the Weber Basin latest meeting. That would really help to expand the dashboard.
I think that's really helpful. And I'm going to riff on that just a minute. I mean, if you look at where part of our deficiencies are on Great Salt Lake, we actually don't have as many gauges as you would like to see. We don't have a gauge south of Corinne, for instance, right? That's reliably monitored. And one of the first things we're going to be doing is put in at that bridge that crosses out of the bird refuge, right, and into Bear River Bay. So we actually have a gauge on what that is, and we can monitor it real time. That's something that I think is really important because ultimately more information is better when it comes to this.
Thanks, Brian. Dave, I thought you had a hand up. Do you have a, yeah, so Dave Livermore online. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Brian, thank you for serving in this role. It's just another example of your great public service that we appreciate very much. And Tim, thank you for all your legislative work that's really gotten us where we are today. I wanted to circle back, maybe Brian, for your benefit and others, to the early days of GSLAC. Actually, it's 15 years, not 13, because Governor Huntsman created a council through executive order in 2008, and SB 343 created the council in 2010. And in those early days, we were trying to solve, in a way, what is existing now, which is we actually counted, and there were 40 different jurisdictions that had some say-so over Great Salt Lake policy. And so the idea was to use this body as a coordinating entity to share resources and knowledge, really, particularly knowledge. And over the years, GSLAC, and I'm going to play Don's role because he's always a great promoter of GSLAC, did the first economic study of the value to the lake, created the first kind of gauge of lake health, and then fast forward to modern times, did commission the 12 strategies of the Great Salt Lake. This is really all before the current crisis. So I guess that's a little history, but my question is kind of related to what you were saying before, is in the past we had very little, frankly, political power because just the nature of the beast. We had explored looking at other models, the Puget Sound Commission in the Northwest, the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, the Lake Tahoe, the Chesapeake Bay Commission. All of those entities have coordinating roles, but they also have some regulatory teeth. But some of us were in favor of having that model, but it didn't end up that way. So, but the current partnership with you at the helm, that can be very powerful because of your ties to the legislature and Tim's and others. And so I'm hoping you'll continue to use the GSLAC as a resource for knowledge and science and kind of policy. And you'll, if you have time, become a regular attendee of council meetings to augment that partnership. We're here to help. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. And that is my intent to be a regular attendee. I have not been a regular attendee to this meeting in the past. I will say this, though, your reports are awesome and extraordinarily useful to the policymaking process. Dave, your question on the regulatory function, I think is something we're still trying to figure out. The statute does say the commissioner reports directly to the governor as a cabinet level position, as well as to the president of the Senate and speaker of the House. So while there may not be a regulatory rulemaking function, there certainly is a direct communication to those that have the sources of power in the state. And we look forward very much to working there effectively on behalf of the lake.
Well,
Thank you.
Brian. Thanks, Dave, for that. The history is really helpful just to see and look forward to sort of fleshing that out further as we move forward. Brian, we appreciate that. I think that's kind of our time that we have allotted for this. I'm sure Brian's open to additional questions. If you got any last words, Brian?
So I just wanted to apologize for being late. I was at a meeting for the governor's Unified Office of Economic Opportunity meeting at the Capitol. And I left with just enough time to get here. And then I made the bad decision to not follow my phone. And I took a tour of West Farmington. Yes. That is beautiful. So I apologize. The only solace I have in having that tour of West Farmington is that I noticed that there was about 3 or 4 other cars that were taking the same U-turns that I was. So it wasn't just me that had this experience. Other attendees in the meeting were able to see that. So Randy, thanks for having such a beautiful community.
It was,
All right.
the tour to Farmington was in full force this morning, so thanks. Thanks for being here, Brian. It worked out just fine. Okay, thank you very much, and stay tuned.
Thanks, Brian.
The second item on our agenda, we've got Mike Vanderberg of UGS here. Just by way of giving a little bit of context to tee him up, we're going to turn it over to you here just a second, Mike. In 2016, there was a bathymetric study of the Great Salt Lake conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey to map the bottom of the lake, and that produced some great results that a lot of people have relied on. But that old study had some shortfalls, and there was a desire to update it, particularly using new and improved technologies like LiDAR. So subsequent to that, the Utah Geological Survey proposed to do a bathymetric LiDAR study of GSL to map the bottom of the lake, make a more accurate map. To get started, the contractor had to do a pilot study to test and prove the methodology and do some test areas. The advisory council funded that pilot program to the tune of about $75,000. And so we've asked Mike Vanderberg to provide us with a preliminary report. And we'd also point that we sort of did some preliminary money, but the legislature responded by appropriating $1.8 million to do a robust bathymetric LiDAR study for both Great Salt Lake and Bear Lake. And with that intro, Mike, thanks for being here, and we'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. First off, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
I am actually on the shore of a different Great Lake, Lake Michigan, right now. So I apologize for not being there in person. I'm going to try to tee up my presentation here.
It's not every day we get to say bathymetric, LiDAR, things like that. So we're looking forward to the presentation, Mike. And you
okay? Can everybody see the presentation?
Yep, we can see it just great.
Okay, I here sitting on the shore of Lake Michigan. I cannot see any of you when I'm just looking at my own presentation. So if anybody has any questions or comments, or they can't hear me, just give a shout. I'm not going to be able to see any hands raised or anything like that. So first off, I want to build on a point that Commissioner Steed just mentioned about collecting data and collecting more accurate data for Great Salt Lake, which is going to be super important as we move forward. Collecting the best data possible is just going to help into the future, help us all make better decisions on how to protect this lake, how to save this lake, how to get more water to this lake. So I'm going to be talking about bathymetric LiDAR and show very, very preliminary results of our pilot study. So the photo you're looking at is a drone photo from Buffalo Point, and this was in 2021 when the lake to 4190. So you can see a lot of the microbialites, a big microbialite reef that was exposed at that time. Okay, let's talk about bathymetric LiDAR. I'm going to assume that most people in the room know what LiDAR is. Basically, you shoot a laser from an airplane and it maps the surface of the Earth in super fine detail. I'm also going to try to bring up a pointer. Can you see that laser point?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So here, this bottom image on my right is just like a Google Earth image. So ortho imagery, satellite image of some river somewhere. This is just an example. The image in the middle is your typical LiDAR shot with a near infrared or a red laser. You can see that red laser bounces off the surface of the water. So you only get a representation of the surface of the water and then any dry land. The image at the top is a combination of a red laser along with a green laser. Now, the green laser will penetrate into the water and bounce off the floor of the river or the floor of the lake or whatever it is. And so you get the red light, you combine the two, you get the red laser, typical LiDAR on dry land, and the bathymetric LiDAR using the green laser will give you the floor and the details of the floor of that body of water, in this case, the lake, of course. So that's the difference between just regular LiDAR and bathymetric LiDAR, two different lasers. So why do we want to collect this data? You know, just stepping back a little bit, LiDAR is relatively new. I would say in the last 10 years, and there's been increases in the resolution and the quality of the data you can get with bathymetric LiDAR. And this is something that I've been curious about for a long time out at Great Salt Lake and have been trying to get funded actually since 2015. I've tried various funding streams. There's basically no luck until the lake got super low and everybody got super interested in Great Salt Lake again. And so kudos to the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. I greatly thank them for finally throwing some money at this new technology to see if it might actually work. So thank you to the council. So why do we need this data? So as was just mentioned, I think everybody recognizes the limitations of the bathymetry data that was collected in the mid 2000s, about 2005, 2006 by the United States Geological Survey. They used a technique where they had, you know, sonar related techniques from the back of a boat. You couldn't get the boat in the near shore areas. And so a lot of those areas were just estimated. And the bathymetry is not really based on real data. And I'll show you some examples in a minute of how the bathymetry in the nearshore environment doesn't really match reality very well. And so we need much more accurate data, especially in the nearshore environment. This is vital for modeling water volumes, of course, vital for modeling the exposure extent. So when lake level comes down, how much of the lake bed is exposed. The bathymetric LiDAR compared to the old data, which was just contour lines for the most part, the bathymetric LiDAR will create a point cloud. So you have a grid of high resolution data points. And in this case, it's about 8 points per square meter. So just orders of magnitude higher resolution data. Some other reasons why we wanted to see if this technology would work is for maybe improved mapping of sublacustrin. Lacustrine, again, is just a fancy word for lake. Sublacustrin Antelope Island section of the Great Salt Lake Fault Zone. So again, looking for fault traces in the bed of the lake. And then my own kind of personal reason for doing this, I have I'll call it a hobby at this point, of studying the microbialite structures out at Great Salt Lake. And so I was curious whether or not the bathymetric LiDAR data could help us better image the structures under the water. Okay, so now going back to this question of the accuracy of the current bathymetry, especially in the nearshore environment, this is something we wanted to investigate further. So in the fall of 2021, lake level was really low, not as low as 2022, but still really low. We flew some drone surveys. So you can see this is Bridger Bay, north end of Antelope Island. Here's Egg Island. This is Ladyfinger Point Visitor Center up here. We flew this grid with our drone. This is about, I would say, 400 to 500 individual photos that then were all stitched together to create a orthomosaic. We actually tied this to elevation using our GPS equipment. And so it's kind of zooming in and rotating a little bit. So now north is actually north. Again, here's Egg Island, Ladyfinger Point, Bridger Bay. Our survey, our drone survey here. And we mainly flew this because I was trying to image the exposure of the microbialites, the northern part of Bridger Bay. But what we noticed, so we have in green, the green lines are the current bathymetry contours from the USGS from that 2006 study. And at the time that we flew this drone survey, the lake elevation was at 4190.5. And I essentially just walked the shoreline taking GPS points as I went. And this red line is the true representation of what the 4190.5 contour line should look like. And so here you have 4191, 4190. And so according to the data, it should be somewhere up in here, but of course it's not true at all. It doesn't match very well. So we even have a 4190.5 contour right next to a 4195 contour. So obviously significant error in that previous data. This is just another example. This is down on the southern shore of Great Salt Lake over near Saltaire. So this is the old Saltaire site. The newer Saltaire is off screen. This is a big microbialite reef that was exposed in the fall of 2021 that we did another drone survey over. You can see again in green the previous bathymetric contours, and the day we flew this flight, the lake elevation was 4190.5, which would put the contours somewhere over here next to the shore. And if you hadn't seen this firsthand, you would expect this giant island out here should be underwater according to the old data, but of course it was not underwater, it was fully exposed. Okay, so going back to the extent of the microbialites, again, this is why I first started pursuing this technology and wondering if it would work out at Great Salt Lake, because we were interested in better mapping the extent of the microbialites. Previous mapping done by Rob Baskin at USGS here on the right in these green polygons, we have determined are a little bit inaccurate. We have actually done some new mapping with a student from Weber State, Laura Wilcock, professor at Weber State, Carrie Franz, and myself. We've done some new mapping using other types of imagery. And you can see we've been able to greatly refine the extents. Our extents are in blue, the old extents are in green. But we think that the bathymetric LiDAR data could actually help us refine those extents even further. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the pilot study. So we want to, of course, start with a pilot study because we don't really know how well this is going to work out at Great Salt Lake. Great Salt Lake is a challenging environment for this type of technology. So before we spend millions of dollars on collecting this data, let's spend a much smaller amount of money to see how well this works. And so this was the grant, the proposal that we submitted for the pilot project. We got $75,000 from the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, and the Utah Geological Survey chipped in $25,000. So the total cost of this pilot project was $100,000. It is over an area of about 50 square miles, and you can see the polygon here on the map. We basically did the entire west side of Antelope Island, all the way out to roughly the center of the lake, or the deepest part of the lake. We chose this area in the South Arm because it included all these different types of things we wanted to see imaged it with this data. So you have areas with microbialites, you have areas without microbialites, you have lots of faults. So the solid black lines are kind of known faults, and the dotted black lines are inferred faults. And so we wanted to kind of see how well this data imaged both of those. But then also, of course, we have a lot of kind of near shore environment. And then, of course, we have the kind of steeper shelf break out into the deeper water. So we had a little bit of everything that we wanted to kind of use to see how well this technique worked out at the lake. Now, the most important considerations when you're shooting bathymetric LiDAR are going to be depth, which is fairly intuitive, water clarity, and of course the weather. So out of those three, the water clarity is probably the most important. You need clear water in order for that laser to penetrate all the way down to the bottom of the lake and reflect back. As everybody knows, Great Salt Lake is not very clear. It's very murky water for most of the time. These graphs here in the lower part of the slide represents water clarity over time. And this is a model that was put together by a company based off satellite imagery. So this is not a direct measure, but it's a modeled measure, but it shows kind of what we're after, in that in the spring, we get better water clarity than any time else during the year. So I've been calling this our clarity window. And what happens is the brine shrimp start grazing off all the algae in the water column, and you get a brief period of several weeks where the water is actually very clear and you can see all the way down to the bottom. So this was the window we wanted to shoot for when we collected this data. And so even though this project was funded almost a year ago, we waited until this June 2023 to actually collect this data. Now with the massive snowpack and the increase in runoff that we saw this year, I was a little nervous about what that would do to the clarity of the water. And so we had Captain Jim McLuhan from Wildlife Resources out there on his boat, and he was feeding us Secchi disk data all through May and into early June. And it was looking pretty grim towards the end of May. Secchi disk depths were only in the half meter range, which was pretty terrible. But then like right on cue, first week of June, things started clearing up. The brine shrimp started they're grazing, and he got Secchi disk depths of 2 to 4 meters. And so that's when we pulled the trigger and contacted the company, and they deployed their plane and started collecting the data this June. So it actually worked out pretty well. Here's just some photographs of the data collection. So the company that we procured through, the normal state purchasing procedures was NV5. They used to be Geospatial, something. Now I forget. Called NV5 now. They're an industry leader in LiDAR and in bathymetric LiDAR. They were familiar with Great Salt Lake. They have flown other surveys around Great Salt Lake. And so they were familiar with the weather patterns and kind of the logistics of flying in and out. I think they flew in and out of Ogden. The data was actually collected on June 22 to 25. Lake elevation at that point was around 4194. This was the sensor they used, the Lycra Chiroptera 4X. So you can see a picture of the plane here, the sensor in the plane that would shoot through the belly of the plane, photo of inside the plane. But then they also had ground crews out there taking kind of reference GPS measurements, so everything could be geospatially corrected. Here's just a picture of the plane in the air. This is on Antelope Island. Okay, some very, very, very preliminary data. It actually takes them about 60 days to process this much data, so we won't get the full data set until later in August. But I told them I was presenting to this group and that I needed some imagery to show them. So they supplied me with some preliminary data just to show how well it works. But of course, there's a lot more data processing to happen. So what you're looking at here are two cross sections. So these are slices of the data. So this would be near Bridger Bay, so onshore. You hit the lake bed in the water column and to offshore. So you can see a little ramping of the data. And the whole idea with showing these slides is that they got good penetration to the floor of the lake down to 2 meters in this upper example and down to 4 meters plus in this lower example. So the kind of higher clarity highlighted, the line at the bottom here are laser points bouncing off of the lake bed. And as you can see, when you get deeper, there's a lot of laser points that bounce off something in the water column. Maybe they're bouncing off a brine shrimp or something like that. But there's still enough laser points that are making their way all the way down to the floor of the lake that you can filter out all this noise and still get a good representation of the floor of the lake. Again, this bottom example, you can see a really nice solid or nearly solid line at the base of this data set representing the floor. I asked them, because I've never seen this type of data before. I asked them, is this typical or is this really good? And they actually said this amount of scatter is typical, even in freshwater lakes, and that they were really happy with the quality of the resolution of the lake floor itself. So that's good. Another quick example. So we were on a call just last week and they were kind of flying me around the area, showing me the data, and I had them take a couple of screenshots for me. So this is the bathymetric LiDAR data here on my left. And what it shows are these giant, we call them giant desiccation polygons. The reason they show up in this bathymetric data is because the perimeters of the polygons are lined with microbialites. And then these microbialites have a relief of 1 to 1.5 feet. And so you can see them also here on this Google Earth image. So what this is showing, which is super exciting, is that we're getting resolution of like topographic relief in the bottom of the lake of 1 to 1.5 feet, which to me is just amazing. So you can see some other features. There's this linear feature up here, which also, it's really faint, but it does show up in the bathymetry data. It's those types of features that have, just maybe a little bit of relief on them that could be related to subaqueous faults. This is another image. So they, of course, shot the green laser combined with the red laser. So we got just typical topographic LiDAR data, anything that was onshore. And then as you transfer into the water, the green laser takes over, and this is a representation of the lake bed. The colors here just represent different elevations. Again, it was just meant as an example. Okay, so where do we go from here? As I said, this is a pilot study. We're going to take the next couple months, 2 to 3 months, to really process this data, analyze this data, and determine how well we think it worked in the Great Salt Lake environment. It was mentioned that the 2023 legislature did allocate about $1.8 million to collect additional bathymetric LiDAR data at Great Salt Lake and at Bear Lake. So I worked with a group to, of course, kind of estimate how much it would cost to do the entire lake. And we were working on different boundaries. This is the boundary that we settled on, which was, I call it the Holy Grail boundary, because it includes pretty much everything we could ever want to look at. Whether the 1.8 would actually get us data out to this wide boundary is yet to be seen. This still might be refined a little bit, but it does include the lake proper. It includes a lot of the mud flat all the way around the lake. So that would be new topographic LiDAR on the mud flat areas. It does include Bear River Bay. It includes Farmington Bay. There was some interest from groups like Ducks Unlimited in looking at those two bays and looking at the wetlands around those bays. And this also includes doing this employing this technology out at Bear Lake. The Bear Lake portion will probably only be about $100,000 to $200,000 of this 1.8 million. So just a small piece. Bear Lake will be much easier because you don't have the clarity issues. It's relatively clear. We can also kind of chop this up and do this in stages. We don't have to fly this entire data set at one time. We can do Bear River Bay at one point, whenever the most appropriate time would be. We could do Farmington Bay at one point. We can do Bear Lake at one point. We can do different parts of Great Salt Lake at different times. That 1.8 million was allocated to Forestry Fire Estate Lands, but we're working on some agreements with them. I think UGS will take the lead on administering this program. We will most likely use a little bit of that money for data processing, data interpretation, not just data collection. Again, I want to stress that this spending this 1.8 million is dependent on the results of the pilot study. We don't want to spend money on something that's just not going to work. If we determine that bathymetric LiDAR just does not work in the deepest part of the lakes, we're not going to go out and recollect that data. We'll focus on the near shore environment instead. We already mentioned about the interpretation. We'll have to go through, of course, the normal state procurement processes. And I already mentioned we could collect this data in stages. So that is everything I have. This is just another image of Bridger Bay from 2021 showing the microbialites. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate that informative presentation. We have just a couple of minutes left on this agenda item. Anybody have a burning question for Mike on this really interesting stuff? Joe.
Great work, Mike, and fingers crossed that we get some good data here in the next month or so.
Yeah.
What did the company, what's their sort of perspective on the ability to do this in the North Arm with the higher TDS? I know that there were some, the questions last year and past couple of years on that. Any update on that?
So the TDS of the water is not the concern. It's the clarity of the water. So if solutes are dissolved into the water, that's not a big deal for the data collection. It's how murky the water is. And so how well this works up in the North Arm is going to depend on that water clarity. And of course, we have a lot of data on water clarity in the South Arm. I don't know if that same data exists in the North Arm. We can't access the North Arm with a boat at the moment. We go out there with kayaks sometimes, so maybe we'll try to take some SecuDist data or collect SecuDist data from our kayaks at some point to kind of gauge the water clarity, but that could be an issue in the North Arm.
Thanks, Mike. Additional questions? Brian?
just a process question, Mike. Do you have enough resources then to complete the full lake? If you find this is worthwhile, is 1.8 enough to cover it?
It's hard to say. To get the entire lake proper, all the mud flats, all the wetlands, the 2 bays, and Bear Lake, 1.8 might not quite be enough. But there's questions about whether or not we actually need to do the entire mud flat, because we do have LiDAR data that was taken in 2016. So we might be able to shrink that boundary a little bit. There's questions of whether or not we need to shoot LiDAR data across, say, like US Magnesium's evaporation ponds. We might not be able to do that. So we might be able to carve off that whole area west of Stansbury Island. And so I think there's still work to be done to refine some of those boundaries that could help us fit within that 1.8 million budget. But of course, then it also will depend on, do we even collect this data in the middle of the lake where it's at its deepest, because it just might not work out there. And so if we don't do that, that will also save some money. So there's scenarios where, yes, we could use all the money, but there's scenarios where, oh, maybe we only spend $1 million of it.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, comment here in the back.
Yeah, Mike, I think a pilot study would be warranted for the wetlands as well. So with your stress on the clarity of the water, all the wetlands have submerged aquatic vegetation, emergent vegetation, a bunch of sediment that's moving around a lot, and then also carp grazing, which kick up a lot of sediment. So I think your pilot study was great, but I would encourage a pilot study in the wetlands before doing that.
Yeah, it might be a scenario where we use some of that 1.8 to shoot some data over a wetlands, process that data, interpret that data, and then decide how we want to move forward for other areas.
Jeff, let's have this be our last question. Go ahead, Jeff.
Mike, just to follow up on that, with all of the wetlands, typically they're all drained in late winter, early spring. And that's a time when, the carp probably are less active and there's not as much algae either, and it may be less turbid. You might think about just timing of that.
Mm-hmm. I will say the data across the wetlands and even in Farmington Bay, Bear River Bay was something brought up by Ducks Unlimited, and I have been working with them on how and when to collect that data. I had kind of restricted this more to the lake proper itself, but they wanted to extend it out into these other areas. And so we'll definitely work with them on when the best time might be.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to follow up one other thing. There's also an association of duck clubs. I think we would really benefit and appreciate the work you're doing out there. I think it would really benefit all of that wetland complex out there for a number of reasons. So not just Ducks Unlimited, but we'd be more than happy to help and support you in any way we can.
Great, sounds great.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, Mike. We really appreciate your time calling in from the shores of Lake Michigan. Please travel safe and bring some water back with you. We could use a little more out here. So thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Our next agenda item, many of you are aware of this, but through a change that was made a few years ago, a statutory change that was made a few years ago, the council is able to direct $125,000 per fiscal year from the brine shrimp royalty to critical projects or research or other priorities for the lake. And since that change was made in the law, this council's done quite a bit. So they've helped fund, for example, the economic significance of Great Salt Lake study that many of you are familiar with, revised assessment of Great Salt Lake health, various research priorities, Phragmites, strategies to increase lake elevation, reports about drying lakes around the world, updates on cost and value, Water reuse study was one. Equation of state update, water and land use planning integration. Just a whole lot of different things have been funded through this. And so in 2022, 2023, we funded the Bathymetric LiDAR project that was just mentioned, and a Great Salt Lake shorebird study, which is going to be on our September agenda, and then a Bear River economic study to include contributions by the Great Salt Lake, and that'll be that report will come out in 2024. So today we're going to consider approvals for projects for the 2023-2024 cycle. So we're talking about the next tranche, 125,000. And at our May meeting, this body appointed kind of a subcommittee to look at some recommended projects. That was Don, Leonard, Leland, Myers, Ann, Neville, and Marisa. And Marisa is going to talk about the 3 projects that have been recommended so far. So Marisa, turn it over to you.
Thanks Tim. The first project I'll talk about, and if you've seen the agenda, these projects are listed out as well. I also have copies if you need one. The first project that the GSLAC Projects Committee contemplated funding is the Great Salt Lake Hydromapper maintenance cost. So the USGS partnered with FFSL and GSLAC in fiscal year 2022 to complete the Great Salt Lake Hydromapper, which is an online interface displaying USGS water level and salinity data in a digestible format. Members of the public and the Great Salt Lake community are able to easily retrieve water salinity and lake level data, as well as access the Great Salt Lake Basin water dashboard. The annual cost for the USGS to maintain this website is $5,322. FFSL will plan on covering this cost for fiscal year 2025 onward. However, the USGS is requesting GSLAC funds to cover this cost for fiscal year 2024. So this will be a one-time granting of $5,322 from GSLAC funds. And Tim, I don't know if you want to discuss these as we go.
I think just go ahead and run through them, and then we'll stop with the questions at the end.
So the second project that the GSLAC Project Committee has contemplated funding for, the USGS submitted a proposal to the Great Salt Lake Tech Team Grant Program entitled "A Complete and Easily Accessible Means for Obtaining Volume and Area Estimates of the Great Salt Lake as a Function of Lake Level." So due to limitations on funding, the Great Salt Lake Tech Team Project Subcommittee recommended this project to GSLAC. The project aims to develop a high-resolution topobathymetric data set that will include volume and area estimates of Great Salt Lake at 0.01 foot intervals. Previously, this data has only provided volume and area estimates at 0.5 foot intervals. Gathering this data at a finer resolution will allow us to understand how the measured lake level translates to the volume of water and area of lakebed submerged. As we are faced with issues such as dust and salinity, having this more robust volumetric and geospatial data for Great Salt Lake is imperative. This proposal is requesting $22,674, with the USGS providing over 50% in matching funds. And that is the second project. So moving on to the third project on our contemplation list. So as we all know, management of Great Salt Lake involves many and diverse stakeholders with specific interests, specialties, and funding sources. Implementing project work often requires stakeholder coordination for the sustainable management of Great Salt Lake. GSLAC, FFSL, and the Division of Water Resources wish to better understand the types of projects that need to be completed to improve Great Salt Lake conditions. The Great Salt Lake Enhancement Projects project, as I've affectionately called the Projects Project, will contract a third party to solicit input on necessary projects from a wide variety of stakeholders. The resulting project report will emphasize necessary on-the-ground work, but can also include research or data development. The project report will be made public and serve as a reference document for all stakeholders interested in completing projects to benefit Great Salt Lake. GSLAC, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and the Division of Water Resources have agreed to contract this project for no more than $75,000, split evenly between the three. So GSLAC would contribute a maximum of $25,000 to the project. The Great Salt Lake Advisory Council Project Subcommittee reviewed these three projects and support the use of GSLAC funds for each. As we will have GSLAC funds remaining, we will continue to accept and review project proposals moving into fiscal year 24. And that's all from me.
Thanks, Marisa. Really appreciate that summary. I just note that Brian's enthusiasm, the commissioner's enthusiasm at the project list. But no, great summary. And I just point out that the working group, the subcommittee, unanimously recommended these projects for funding. Again, this accounts for about 50,000 of the 125, so it leaves roughly 75 for additional projects that could be considered for this group. So about the projects that Marisa summarized, any questions? Tom? No? Anybody else? Okay, I want to make sure we got questions, but I think we're ready for motions if people are ready. So any questions about them?
Yeah, I got one question.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe, please.
In light of Mike Vandenberg's presentation on really honing the bathymetry, it seems like that would really inform the volumetric and geospatial data collection. It seems like it's more of a sequencing question. If we could lock in the LiDAR data before that's conducted.
Yes, comment, Marisa, any reaction to that?
I do believe USGS and the UGS work hand in hand on this. And this proposal in the short term is meant to enhance the HydroMapper website so we can increase the public's ability to go on there and toggle with lake levels and see what different volume and area estimates look like. I'm hoping that, timing wise it works out, but as Mike mentioned with the LiDAR data, it's a little difficult to predict exactly when they'll be able to collect it. So logistically, I can't quite comment on how that would work.
Understand.
Just a follow-up question on that would be if the sequencing, if there's a lag on the post-processing and stuff, so they drag into next fiscal year, there's no problem if we approve it now for Marisa and the team to just wait and sequence it like Joe said. Yeah,
I think that's
so.
right.
Yeah, contracting wise, we handle all of the accounting aspects on our end, and we're relatively flexible with that kind of stuff.
No comment here, public.
Science Center. Thanks, Marisa.
Thanks, David.
The way I'm thinking of the currently proposed topobathy, I'm really hopeful for what Mike presented with the green LiDAR. It is a pilot study, and this existing topobathy is kind of a bird in the hand. All of these data sets do exist. They're just disparate and aren't necessarily talking to one another. And so the idea is to take the data that do exist, bring them together. And then I will say, we have a great history of collaborating and working closely with UGS. So would want to continue that depending on the results of Mike's work with the green laser.
So David, based on that comment, it sounds like it's not a precondition to get this new LiDAR data to do this particular coordination piece we're looking at. Is that correct?
And I think the difficulty is I'm really looking forward to this. The coverage will be much tighter. The LiDAR does provide a better coverage than what the initial sonar stuff, especially for the bathymetry. Again, this being a bird in the hand, the data sets exist. There are ongoing studies that would rely on the merging of these existing data sets. And so anyway, that's the way I'm thinking of this current Bathy study.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that clarification. Tom, you had a question? Or you're good? Okay, so I think Leland's ready to give a motion unless we have any other questions. Okay, Leland's going to repeat his motion to approve the recommended project funding list. That's a second from Tom. Any discussion from members of the council? Seeing none, I'll go ahead and place that motion to recommend these funding items. All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed say no. Any abstentions? I see no abstentions, no objections, so unanimous approval of those recommended funding items. Let me just point out, moving forward, again, we do have another roughly $73,000 in this cycle, and If you have additional ideas or suggestions, please feel free to bring them to Don or Marissa's attention. I know there's some things in the works. Brigham Daniels, for example, who's a professor at the U of U, is really looking at state and local government policy, for example, and sort of the gaps in those policies and how to fill that gap. I know I've heard various discussions. We've had some about coordinating business support or grassroots, various different things like that. So looking forward, and I know there's some other ideas in the mix that have, are just at various stages of maturity. So please give that some thought. And if you're aware of some pressing issues that could benefit from a little bit of this gap funding, we don't have enough funding to do major heavy lifts on our own, but often it can help close that gap or help an effort along one way or the other. So please get those thoughts and suggestions and feel free to bring them forward, and we'll take a look. Okay, hold on a second. All right, so at every next item on the agenda, every GSLAC meeting, we try to take public comment and give opportunities to members of the public to make comment. And so I want to open up briefly for public comment. I think, Marcel, you've got something. And then Lynn. Marcel, please come up. Marissa's got a microphone for you there. Just got to push the button, make sure it goes green.
Great, thanks. So I have two little announcements. Actually, one's a big one on behalf of the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust, which is co-managed by the Nature Conservancy and National Audubon Society. So next week, keep an eye out. This is a heads up that we will be opening a funding opportunity. You may be aware that the legislation that established the trust specifies that 25% of the funding would be used to protect or restore, am I speaking? Protect or restore wetland habitats in the surrounding Great Salt Lake ecosystem to benefit the hydrology of Great Salt Lake. So there will be a funding opportunity opening up a process to take project applications, and more information about what is required for those applications and who's eligible and all the rest of the details should be available. And Marisa, hope you won't mind, but we'll ask you to send out an email with the announcement when it's ready. Thanks. And then I just had one other thing I wanted to say. Audubon staff and TNC staff are, most of us are wearing two hats, helping with the trust and our own normal jobs, but we've hired the first time full-time person working for the trust. Adam Wickline, who introduced himself earlier, is the senior project manager for the trust and will be doing a lot of work on the ground and in the field. He comes most recently from the Summit Land Conservancy, and prior to that, some of you might know him from his time at the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program. So thanks very much, Tim and Council.
Thank you, Marcel, and welcome aboard. We look forward to working with you. So that's exciting stuff. And just want to, I serve on the board of the trust, but really want to commend Marcel, Audubon, TNC, really for the amazing amount of work that's gone into the trust so far. They're doing some great stuff, and there's a lot of exciting things to come. So thank you. Lynn, you had something.
Thank you. Congratulations, Brian. Looking forward to working with you. Just a reminder, we have our 2024 Great Salt Lake Issues Forum scheduled for next May 8th, 9th, and 10th at the University of Utah Guest House and Conference Center. The title is Great Salt Lake to Preserve and Protect in Perpetuity. How are we doing? So at that point in time, there'll be a lot of updates on information that we're hearing about today and ongoing efforts to generate insights and inform management opportunities for the system. So put it on your calendar and to be continued. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Any other public comments we have online? Jamie.
Hi there. I just want to invite everybody into the Education Center at Farmington Bay if you're there. An Argentinian mural artist came and put a wonderful new mural in the Education Center that's really kind of focused on the ecology of Great Salt Lake. It was supported by Audubon, and the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources put a ton of work into it. And Mr. Craner's sixth grade class from Emerson Elementary raised a bunch of money also. So go in there, check it out. It's really beautiful, and a bunch of people worked really hard in thinking about how to connect our sister saline lakes of Mono Lake and Mar Chiquita in Argentina and Canada with these murals that will kind of see all of our birds traveling back and forth. So go check it out. It's really beautiful.
Thanks for that, Jamie. My burning question is, does it feature brine shrimp?
Yes, that was one of the stipulations of Mr. Craner's class.
I was going to say.
It had to have brine shrimp if they were going to fund it.
I'm super cute brine shrimp if I had to guess. So, yeah. Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, any other public comments? Seeing none, we'll close the public comments. Appreciate those contributions from members of the public that really sort of show just how much is going on in different places. That brings us close to the end of our agenda here today. Our next meeting will be held here on September 23rd at 13th. Yeah, just transposing numbers in my mind. Bad at math. So we're going to talk about the Great Salt Lake Shorebird Survey that the council helped fund. We'll talk about the Integrated Basin Plan from the Division of Water Resources, and also an update on the trust Marcel was just talking about. So looking forward to that. Any suggestions from members of the council on agenda items either for that meeting or future meetings? Tom?
You know, there was a recent study published, the Holocene water balance variations in the Great Salt Lake, Utah. It's an interesting study, but it takes a geologic times perspective and looks at the last 7,000 years on the Great Salt Lake. And it's pretty academic, but if you could have maybe a visitor on that, help us keep perspective here. We are at a time of certain kinds of salinity. We've been there before in the last 7,000 years. And it's just an interesting artifact that I think you keep in the back of your mind. You know, man has caused obviously impacts on the Great Salt Lake, but if you look at the natural variability in a geologic sense, we haven't changed that much except for the 20th century where we've made some changes to the north and south arm and things like that. But I thought it was an interesting study that might be an interesting short agenda item at some point if you get a right presenter.
Thanks for that suggestion, Tom. Other suggestions that occur to people right now? If not, obviously you can forward suggestions to Don or Marisa at any time. We appreciate those suggestions and from the public as well if you think that there's something that has some value. Okay, so I think that's it. Anything else from members of the council? Seeing none, I just want to thank everybody for attending today, for navigating the Tour de Farmington and finding your way out here. I want to thank all those that are participating online. I know it's hard to do so, but appreciate you taking the time. And thanks to Marisa for staff support and DNR staff for the help with the AV and managing the technical side of things. Really appreciate that. So with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Concludes our business. Leland, so moved. Second? Okay, second from Joe. All in favor of adjourning, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay, we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.